You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to have you back, Prashant. How was your trip to China most recently?
It was good, very productive.
Great. You were there for the Xiangshan Forum?
Yeah, that's right. And there were a number of other China, Southeast Asia, and China ASEAN related activities there as well. So it was good to take part in that.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we won't be talking about China or Southeast Asia on this podcast today. Over the weekend, while we were both traveling, it appeared that Sri Lanka thrust itself face first into a constitutional crisis. And we've talked about Sri Lanka a little bit on this podcast, and certainly its role as a important geopolitical player, given its strategic location in the center of the Indian Ocean, just a few miles off the southern tip of India. It's turned into a hot zone in particular for the geopolitical wrangling between New Delhi and Beijing. But this constitutional crisis really appeared to come out of nowhere. Though that isn't entirely the case. I mean, we can talk a bit about the origins, but yeah, I mean, this is really something that I think we should pay close attention to. So I'm glad that we're going to spend a podcast talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess probably the first place to start, because this is a pretty complicated situation, as you said, is maybe, you can lay out, what is exactly at stake here and who are the players, right? Because we have one president, two prime ministers, at least three major powers with interests here. So maybe we can start there and then move on to figure out what the implications are geopolitically.
Yeah, that's a good way to start, I think. The way that I found it helpful to think about what's happening in Sri Lanka right now is to think about it in pretty much as three men trying to position themselves for power and glory. So two of these men, Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe, came to power in the 2015 January elections, which were also a bit of a surprise. So Maithripala Sirisena, who is the current president of Sri Lanka, was formerly a member of the previous government, and this is where the third man comes in, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who is probably well known to some listeners of this podcast. I think we've talked about him in the context of China's Belt and Road and other initiatives there. So Rajapaksa was Sri Lanka's president for about 10 years, and he controversially oversaw the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, including overseeing atrocities committed by the Sri Lankan armed forces. But in 2015, in the elections, he was unexpectedly defeated on sort of a wave of anti-incumbency sentiment towards him, given domestic political sentiment, and also due to Sirisena's ability to pull in votes not only from Sri Lanka's Sinhalese majorities, but also the minority Muslim and Tamil populations. And when Sirisena came to power, there was sort of a lot of effusive hope. In fact, I think I did a podcast in early January 2015 that you can go back and listen to if you want sort of a time capsule of how people talked about Sirisena when he was first voted in, that, he would balance out Sri Lanka's foreign policy more evenly between India and China, whereas Rajapaksa had taken the island very strongly in a pro-China direction. He would take seriously the issue of truth and reconciliation in the aftermath of the Sri Lankan Civil War and human rights. He would reduce the powers of the Sri Lankan presidency, and he did some of those things initially. But as time went on, not only did he kind of peter off, but Ranil Wickremesinghe, the prime minister, who is from another party, so they were in a unity government coalition arrangement. So Wickremesinghe's party is the United National Party, and Sirisena is from the Sri Lankan Freedom Party, the SLFP. There appeared to be growing fissures between the president and the prime minister, which led us to this point in October 2018 when Sirisena decided that he would dissolve cabinet, he would dismiss the prime minister, and here's where the constitutional question comes in, is can the Sri Lankan president do that? Most analysis that I've read, I'm not a Sri Lankan constitutional expert, would suggest that he cannot do that. The president may appoint a prime minister, but he cannot dismiss a prime minister. And so Wickremesinghe has decided that he won't vacate the prime minister's residence, and he's been there for the past 5 days as this crisis has played out. His supporters are out in the streets as of this morning protesting, and we've had at least one death. So political violence, sadly, is not alien to Sri Lanka, and there is concern that if this constitutional crisis does persist, there could be widespread bloodshed. So Mahinda Rajapaksa, in the meantime, has been sworn in along with a new cabinet as the prime minister, which means that legally there are now two men claiming to be the prime minister of Sri Lanka. The legislature, in the meantime, appears to be siding with Wickremesinghe. his interpretation of events is that he should have the opportunity to prove that he still enjoys a majority of support in parliament, which is true. Rajapaksa does not have that kind of majority right now. So that's where we are. And the reason that I worry about the possibility of violence is particularly because Sirisena has also prorogued the parliament from meeting until November 16th, which gives about 2 weeks where lawmakers won't have a voice, the Supreme Court won't have a voice, and this will really be sort of the rule of the jungle when it comes to protesters from both sides, or at least three sides. You also have Rajapaksa loyalists sort of duking it out. So that's sort of a broad overview of how we got here.
Yeah, and I think in particular the point you raised about the fact that with this country in limbo now, with two people essentially contesting one position, and with the suspension, right, of parliament, the fact that this may actually be settled on the streets rather than sort of rule of law is particularly worrying. And then you also have that sort of there's an overlay of geopolitics here, where you have the involvement of India, you've got the involvement of China, and you've got the involvement of the United States. So maybe I guess the next thing we can talk about is the geopolitical angle here. How have these, it's still early days, but how these countries have kind of responded to these domestic realignments.
Yeah. So in India, there's obviously a very hot debate going on right now about events in Sri Lanka. India and Indian analysts take a strong interest in events in the Indian Ocean. I think people are still just kind of coming out of celebrating events in the Maldives, which we also talked about, including the election of the opposition leader, who is definitely more pro-India than Abdullah Yameen, the outgoing autocrat. But it appears that, as is often the case, India gets to take one step forward in the neighborhood and take one step back, as appears to now be the case in Sri Lanka. So the three men that we talked about, Sirisena, Rajapaksa, and Vikram Singh, they often get kind of dropped into these buckets. Vikram Singh is broadly seen as pro-India, Rajapaksa is broadly seen as pro-China, and Sirisena is broadly seen as a little bit of a more even-keeled, balanced player. But those descriptions aren't necessarily right, or if they were right, they probably aren't true today. With Rajapaksa in particular, I think there's potentially some interesting developments behind the scenes that we don't fully know about. I should caveat that, a lot of what I'm saying about these three leaders and what they are trying to do and what their motivations are is still quite unknowable. A lot of people suspect that there has been some secret wheeling and dealing that we're simply not privy to. Rajapaksa, for instance, is re-entering government at a time when members of his family are going to be standing trial for corruption under his reign. So him coming back to power could have something to do with that. He could have brokered an arrangement with Sirisena. And by the way, I should have mentioned that Sirisena, before he ran for president in 2015 and defeated Rajapaksa, was actually a member of Rajapaksa's government. The two men actually have a very similar ideological heritage. They were co-partisans, and Sirisena was part of the cabinet before he eventually became president and ousted Rajapaksa. So this is kind of a revolving door in a way. But to go back to the geopolitical context, Rajapaksa was just in India in September, which was a pretty interesting visit that I think we should pay more attention to, given events that we're seeing now. And India's reaction has been somewhat muted. India hasn't taken a side yet, and that's very typical for India. When a crisis breaks out in the neighborhood, it says that it is watching events closely and respects democracy, but won't really go much further than that. So that's exactly what the Indian Ministry of External Affairs statement said this weekend when the constitutional crisis erupted. What's really interesting, I think, is the Chinese reaction. China generally tends to be cautious in a situation where there doesn't appear to be a clear winner. In the Maldives, for instance, I think one big sign was that the Chinese did actually congratulate Soli after his victory against Yameen. But here, the Chinese have sided with Rajapaksa, and this maybe plays back to the idea that Rajapaksa is the more pro-China candidate, so China would naturally be eager to welcome him. But there is a risk involved here. If Vikram Singh's case does somehow clear the Supreme Court or find support at the legislature, this could be resolved in his favor. But I think the Chinese have calculated that that won't be the case, that Rajapaksa will come out on top as the next prime minister, and it's best to welcome him early and get on his good side and get ready to do business with him. So that's the Chinese reaction right now. And I think sadly the Chinese might not be wrong about that. If this crisis does play out the way I think it might, I think Rajapaksa might be more likely to to withstand what is likely to be a serious round of potentially public political violence, but also opposition from Parliament. So we'll have to see where things go. And the U.S. response is interesting. The United States has effectively, without taking names, backed Vikram Singh. They haven't put out a statement saying that we support his position and he is the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. But effectively, the case that the U.S. called for in a State Department statement released this weekend called for the Parliament to effectively get back together and to allow the democratically elected representatives of the Sri Lankan people to fulfill their responsibility to affirm who will lead their government. So that comports pretty closely with the position that Vikram Singh has taken. So geopolitically, this is quite interesting. You have three leaders and you have three great powers, and they've each taken sort of a slightly different position here. India, I think, will be the big one to watch in the coming days. I highly suspect that even as India has put out this fairly anodyne statement, it is working behind the scenes to fully grasp what exactly is going on and what the agreement might have been between Sirisena and Rajapaksa. And there's some additional context here for India that I think is quite interesting. So just weeks before this constitutional crisis, Sirisena had actually accused India's external intelligence agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, of trying to assassinate him. And that was potentially being done with Vikram Singh's support. So there were all sorts of conspiracy theories flying out. He later denied that to Modi and said that, when he implied it, he didn't mean that Modi personally had knowledge of it. He said that it was sort of the intelligence agency was going rogue. So don't make anything of that. That's all without evidence and might just be his rantings. But yeah, there's certainly a lot going on here geopolitically as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think important to underscore the point that you mentioned earlier, which is that, viewed from a longer term perspective, this really is a revolving door, right? Where you see personalities come and go. And there are domestic political and economic issues here at play, right? Whether it's Sri Lanka's debt and the worsening economic situation, or whether it's Sirisena's popularity that's been diminishing as well, right? That leads to these sort of realignment of coalitions. So I think on this podcast, we warned with respect to the Maldives, and I think our discussion on Malaysia too, that this is a geopolitics podcast where we think about, major powers and geopolitical implications, but there are these domestic issues that underlie all of this, that sometimes when we characterize it as being sort of this contest among great powers, we miss these domestic political dynamics as well. And we've kind of, I think, covered those as well as the foreign policy dynamics very well, but some of the sensationalist media reporting might make it seem like, Maldives is being, moving one side in terms of U.S.-China relations, and then Sri Lanka is getting on the other side. So that's something which I think we're continuing to see across capitals whenever there is an election or a realignment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's two factors to really pay attention to in Sri Lanka. It is not a country with particularly strong democratic institutions, which means that political personalities and leaders play a big role, and these leaders can be rent-seeking, particularly, with Rajapaksa. I think we saw a lot of that. He certainly doled out a ton of benefits to his family and his loyal partners, and that matters quite a bit when you're sort of being treated as a geopolitical football between India and China, particularly because China is good at exploiting those kinds of impulses among leaders who don't necessarily care so much about the rule of law or institutions. So Rajapaksa's return, I think, does set up China pretty nicely because I think Beijing knows how to work with him. In the meantime, I think the Sri Lankan leadership, if Sirisena and Rajapaksa are the ones to sort of take things forward, have sort of seen, the Hambantota port episode play out and have kind of taken the lesson away from that. So I'd be surprised if this does play out and Rajapaksa does stick around. I'd be surprised if we sort of start seeing, Sri Lanka take on another round of massive unserviceable debt from China. I think, that kind of more balanced perspective might stick around. Although one of the factors here, too, is now the degree to which Sirisena is actually willing to work with India. His kind of 2015 rhetoric about balancing relations no longer seems to apply. And he's been upset about a few specific things, including India's interest in the Trincomalee port and the Colombo port. India has been seeking access to port infrastructure, and I think he's been unhappy with the terms there. And yeah, there are also domestic economic issues and social issues that are that continue to divide Sri Lanka, certainly with the legacy of the civil war being one of those issues. The accountability and transitional justice process hasn't really gone anywhere under Sirisena. It has sort of atrophied since an initial round of optimism in 2015. But at this point, it doesn't appear to be one of his priorities at all. So Prashant, let me just ask you, to kind of close out this is kind of a lesson that we kind of come back to on this podcast a lot, which is that in many of these smaller, strategically important countries, political leaderships come and go, right? And this even happens in sort of major U.S. allied states, right? We've talked about this in the context of the Philippines with the change from Aquino to Duterte, for example. So, kind of looking forward, I'm wondering if you sort of have any other countries that, our listeners should maybe pay attention to or watch for these kinds of leadership transitions in the future, because the Sri Lanka episode, like I said, was relatively surprising, even though the tensions between Wickrem Singh and Sirisena had been there for a while. But in some of the other situations, it's not so clear. We've talked a bit about Indonesia, for instance, but I'm wondering, what other countries might come to mind for you.
Yeah, I think there's probably two groups. I mean, one is where you're going to have elections or changes of leadership over the next 1 or 2 years in strategically significant states, and there I think Thailand is the major one, provided that they actually hold the election, which is another question, right? Repeated postponements. I think there you've seen a U.S. ally move appreciably closer to China, even though there's traditional limits to that. And then the other one is Singapore, actually, where you're going to have a gradual transition away from the Lee family squarely, and gradually for the first time in Singapore's independence. And that's going to be another major one. I think there's another group where you see we're so used to, I think, associating Japan with Abe and India with Modi. I do think, with these two leaders and some domestic questions this year, in the next 2, 3, 4 years, even if they do end up winning individual elections, their popularity and their alignment shifts will be very interesting to watch in the coming years, because they've been such a big part of this landscape that we've been talking about. They're almost taken for granted, I think, among some observers.
Yeah, no, that would have been another good candidate for a podcast this week, since Abe and Modi just had their annual leaders summit in Japan. But yeah, maybe we can come back to that and revisit the India-Japan relationship, which is certainly a topic that I'm very interested in. Well, we'll leave it for there. We'll leave it there for now. The crisis in Sri Lanka, I think, will be worth keeping an eye on. I sadly think that the prospect of political violence is all too high. And like I said, we've seen one person killed already in sort of an unfortunate incident where protesters were blocking a former official from a former cabinet member from accessing his offices, and he was shot by a bodyguard. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but this will be something to keep an eye on. So Prashant, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
So for our listeners, if you have been listening to this podcast for a while, but you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please go ahead and do so. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't left us a review on either YouTube or Google Play, please do that. And finally, I do have to plug our new newsletter. I've been writing a newsletter that sort of distills the major topics in political risk and geopolitical risk in the Asia-Pacific region. You can find this newsletter off our website, actually, at the URL diplomat.substack.com, and you should subscribe. And I'd also welcome your feedback on that newsletter. It's a bit of a new product, so if you have anything that you'd like to see covered more frequently or a different suggestion for a format, please let me know. I'd be very happy to take a look at your feedback. So thanks a lot for listening to the podcast, and we'll be back next week with more.